Hello, welcome to this afternoon's session on traffic analysis. My name is Nicole Cliff. I am the DevOps engineer and instructor here at the Georgia Cyber Center. That's part of the Cyber Workforce Academy on Sarah Reese's team. I've been in networking and security for 25 plus years. It hurts me to say that out loud, but I'm happy to say that I love what I do. I'm blessed to get to come to a job that I'm very passionate about and enjoy the work that I do. And one of the favorite things I get to do is when we get to teach other people and share knowledge in this field. So it's what we're doing today, and very excited about the topic that we have to go over. So without further ado, I will just dive right in. So we'll start off with going over Snort and how Snort rules are formed. We'll look at the purpose of traffic analysis and the importance of that. And then we'll look at some specific tools like Wireshark and TCP dump. And from there, we'll go into deep analysis into packet headers, starting with the layer 2 Ethernet header and moving up to layer 4 at the transport layer, looking at TCP UDP headers. We'll also look at some different protocols, and then you will move into your lab time. Now, before we get started, I am amiss in thinking, Sarah asked me to put out some information at the beginning of the session, so I'm just going to switch over to that window real quick. If you are having any problems with the range, so your range account, or any problems with your VM behaving correctly, you're going to go inside your Canvas course to the Cyber Range Help function. So in the left-hand side, once you log into your course, you'll see an area that says Cyber Range Help. So you're going to click that, and there is a live Teams session where Chris Apsey, the range direction, will help you with any trouble concerning your range account or anything going on with the range. If you have any questions concerning today's lecture, any content that I go over, anything that I demo that you can't find where I'm at, or any questions in regard to that, then you're going to go to this live help with Sarah. Sarah is currently monitoring this Microsoft Teams session. Oh, sorry, I apologize. This one's WebEx, this one's Microsoft Teams, and this one's WebEx. So much for consistency here. And Sarah will be there to help you in that WebEx room. So anybody who has any questions starting off, if we don't want to begin the session, go ahead and reach out to her or reach out to Chris respectively for those issues. So if I were to say to you, intrusions happen and incidents happen, I'm just going to go over some things that put this in perspective. So today, I actually pulled this data yesterday, September 16th. Today's the 26th or the 22nd. I actually didn't pull it yesterday, but I did pull it yesterday from a website that had this actual data. So just to give you context of, if I said incidents happen, you would say, yeah, we know that, Nicole. No revelation there. But what I want to talk to you about is a lot of people prepare for an attack or prepare for an incident, and nobody knows when that's going to occur. And it's not if it's going to happen. We say that now with no revelation as well. It's not if it's going to happen, it's when. And just demonstrating that, pulling these headlines, so the Staples data breach caused by a bug in the order tracking system. So Staples customer data was compromised on September 16th. There was a ransomware attack on Lockbit that happened also on September 16th. There was a breach using a Windows 10 vulnerability. And this particular vulnerability gave a list of native executables in Windows that can download or run malicious code. So every single day we can pull up any cybersecurity news site and find a list of incidents that have happened that have had public disclosure. So it's not if those incidents are going to happen, as I said, it's when they're going to happen. And what can we do? What is the information that we have that we can get those alerts, get that information, drill down into it, and perform the proper analysis in order to find the indicators of compromise so that we can find where that actual attack occurred, what systems were compromised, and then our goal, our ultimate goal, is to prevent that from happening again. So one of the things that we're going to look at first is how our intrusion detection protection systems, whether we're talking about an IDS or an IPS, how those systems alert based on different rules. So we'll look at Snort, and if you are familiar with Snort, maybe some of you on the call are not familiar. I know for our CCNA CyberOps students, we kind of went over this and had several labs that dealt with this particular tool. But it can operate as a packet sniffer. It is a free open source intrusion prevention or detection system depending on how it's configured. It actually performs real-time traffic analysis and can do packet logging for IP networks. And it does so based on its configuration of rules. So it combines the signature, looking at the protocol, and then has the ability to detect protocols, to look for anomalies or any malicious activities. This could be a denial of service attack, a buffer overflow attack, a stealth port scan, a CGI attack, a common gateway interface attack that actually is a web exploitation that allows dynamic content to be run on a web server. Could be SNMP probes or OS fingerprinting attempts. So the Snort system can provide alerts to our, say for instance, a squeal or squirt console that is feeding that console or that dashboard information so that we are notified when these attacks have occurred and we can take the appropriate action. Now later in the slideshow, we'll talk about indicators of attack and indicators of compromise. And that's really at the heart of the conversation, is how we identify those and how, as an analyst, a security analyst, you're able to perform the proper inspection of the data that you're being presented with in order to find the different IOCs, indicators of compromise. So we said that Snort, being an open source intrusion prevention system, was rule-based. Well, let's look at how these rules are organized. They have two different sections. They have a rule header and a rule option. Inside the rule header, you have the actual action that the rule is specified to take. Say, for instance, if you want a match on this particular rule to alert, to send an alert based on a specific protocol, and the protocols that Snort uses are TCP, UDP, IP, as well as ICMP. And then you're going to specify the specific source and destination IP addresses and what portion of that network, so if it's a specific host that you're building the rule for, or if it's an entire network. And then you will specify the source and destination port information, as well as you could specify, well, I already said that, the actual source and destination, or the actual destination IP address. So if you look on screen, you see that there is an example of the rule. So this is the action. This area is the actual protocol. Any has been substituted here for a specific source or a specific destination, or excuse me, in this area it's the specific source, and this is any is the substitution for a specific port. And this arrow gives you the direction of the context of the rule. So this is sourced from and destined to any destination with any specific port in this case. Your rule could send a message to the console. Basically, you want it to be contextual based on what the rule is configured for. So if it was specific to an FTP access or some sort of HTTP header manipulation, anything like that, you could have the message generated to be specific for that particular rule. The content that you want to view, and I also want to say before I forget to tell you that inside your, and I'll go back and show this real quick. Inside your Canvas class, I uploaded a document, and I'm just going to show it to you real quick. It's the Snort Rule infographic. I actually pulled this from the snort.org, and it's a very useful infographic about Snort. There's also a Snort manual that we've uploaded into your Canvas course that you can use. Because when you're configuring these rules, you're going to need to consult the documentation for specific things like maybe the content or the offsite fields in order to see how these are used specifically in a rule. So say for instance, if you're looking at the content is a feature that allows a user to set rules that search for specific content in the packet payload. So if this record set is actually part of the content, then it would generate an alert that would include this message that you see on screen here. So there's lots of useful information as far as how the rule is built, how it's formed, and you can use this infographic to help you with that, as well as the Snort manual that is also included in the Canvas course. So the alert is what action do you want to take? The protocols, what protocol are we including as part of this rule? The message that we want generated, any content that's included in that particular payload. The class type is how has this particular vulnerability been classified? It could be unknown, it could be an actual access attack on users. Each part of the rule here is separated by semicolons, as you can see as far as pointed to the syntax. You also have the SID of the Snort rule, which is an identification for this particular rule. So this was from the SID 21, what is that? 2,100,498. I'm sorry, it's numbers. And it's not Monday, so I can't even blame that on Monday. And this is the actual area, this URL is where the actual rule is stored. So if you wanted to go modify this rule as part of the configuration, this is where that rule is stored and where you would go modify it. Just one more ad for this particular slide. The message, which you're going to get some experience with this when you perform the Snort Lab at the end of this session today, you want to create a message that has some context about the rule that you created. So it's a good idea to have some distinguishable message that would show up when that rule fires. So we've pretty much gone over all the information that you see here. The alert is the actual action that can be taken. So alert is not the only action. You could actually set it up to log instead of alert to the dashboard or the console. You could actually have the action to be pass, where the traffic is actually passed through the IDS. As I said before in the protocol, that could be TCP specified here, something specific to UDP or the ICMP messaging protocol. Any, you can actually, this can be a literal address, or you can substitute with the keyword any. It's important that we note here that you can actually have an address stored in a variable, and that variable will be called as part of that rule functionality to actually translate the variable to the range of network addresses specified. The arrow is contextual for the direction of the flow, and this is from the perspective of the source to the destination. And then the any, that the last part that you see in the rule here is specified for any IP address as well as any layer 4 port. So the part of the message that you see in parentheses, this is actually moving away from the rule header and deals specifically with the rule options. So the portion of the rule that's actually enclosed in parentheses, which you see starting here with the message and ending here at the end of the Rev 8, this contains the text message that will identify the alert. Any metadata that's stored as part of this particular rule is going to be included inside the parentheses. Snort rule messages can also include the source of the rule, and there are 3 common sources for the source of a rule. So the older rules actually created by SourceFire are going to be labeled with that GPL. And the GPL rule set is not Cisco Talos certified, so Cisco Talos is an actual threat intelligence feed that can actually feed your Snort rules to make sure they're most current and up-to-date and updated in real time. These do require, there are different versions or subscriptions that you can buy for Snort rule options, and of course the one that offers the most real-time information is the one you're going to feel most comfortable with, but does require a subscription in order for you to get that. You also have the option to configure your own customized Snort rules. One of the cool things that you get to do in today's lab is actually use the Snort command line to configure a Snort rule. So if you don't have experience with that, you'll be able to gain that experience as part of today's lab. So here we just have a different rule. Instead of using the substitution any, I wanted something more specific here. So you see the different actions that we could take as part of the rule header. The alert, log, pass, activate, and dynamic are more are being phased out as far as rule options, but we have specified in this particular rule that we want this this traffic to generate an alert if it's UDP. So these are the conditions that must be met. If it's a UDP packet that's sourced from the 10.1.1.0/24, so this is specific to the network, and we don't care about the port. So if the traffic is sourced from 10.1.1.0/24 network, any port, and it's destined to, so see our arrow, our destination network, 10.2.0.0/24, and any port. So traffic specifically sourced from the 10.1.1.0/24, destined to 10.0.0/24. So what do we want to do? If that traffic is the UDP protocol, we want it to generate an alert. You can also configure Snort to operate as opposed to IDS or IPS mode. You can actually have it to sniff packets. So in your command line, you would actually go configure or use the command Snort, and you could use any of the options that you see on screen. So if you actually want the Snort action taken in real time to display on screen, you're going to use the TAC V, which is actually verbose, give me the detailed information. -E is going to display the link layer headers. So when you think of link layer, hopefully you're thinking of Ethernet and Ethernet frame. So you can actually help remember, it would be helpful for you to remember this one with like TAC E for Ethernet. If you want the packet payload to be displayed, then you would use the TAC D option. If you want full packet headers with the full packet with the headers, and you want that information displayed in hex format, you're going to use the TAC X. Basic usage of Snort can be set up to point to a configuration file. So Snort TAC C and then point to the name of the configuration file. If you actually have a set of rules, especially if you have customized rules and you want to make sure that your rules are functioning as intended, you want to use the TAC T, TAC C, which actually tests the rules against that specific configuration file. Now, I will tell you that in this business, as part of the Verizon's data breach report, it's the DBIR, I forget what that actually stands for, but if you look in that report, it talks about still over 15% of breaches are caused by misconfiguration. So it's very important when you're configuring rules for firewalls, when you're configuring rules in Snort as part of your IDS or IPS security controls, that you test your configuration. It's one thing to think that you've accomplished something, but it's another to verify it, right? So take that extra step to make sure that you verify the rule that you've written, that it's actually performing and accomplishing the intended result. The alternate alert modes you can see with the TAC A, and that is a capital A. If you want to listen or have Snort sniff packets on a specific interface, you're going to use the TAC I from the command line. And Sarah talked about this morning, your ability to background a specific process. You can run Snort in the background and have it sniff packets using the TAC capital D command. So we've established and we've actually looked at some recent alerts that have happened or incidents that have happened, and we know that that information is going to come up to our dashboard. We're going to view that in some sort of SIM that has normalized that information and all those data types, and then we have to perform the deep dive analysis on that particular alert or incident, if it is indeed an incident. So how can we do that? So we've established that this information, our IDS IPS feeds our SIM console, and then from the SIM console we're able to deep dive and perform a deeper analysis using Wireshark or TCP dump. So now we're going to look at some of the features of Wireshark, the features of TCP dump, and then, as I said before, we'll actually get into the layer 2 through 4 headers. So before we can make the information that TCP dump offers us or Wireshark offers us useful, we have to know what our normal network picture looks like. We have to have the ability to define normal, because a lot of what we're doing as a security analyst is looking at the picture of the network in real-time operation and trying to identify when something suspicious occurs. And that's not always something that may come up in an alert. So we have to have the ability to know when something is off in our network. Well, the only way you're going to have a really good warm fuzzy and indicator that something is wrong is if you know what normal looks like. You have taken the time to capture the appropriate metrics of what's going on in your network. So you know what protocols exist in your network, you know what services are being offered, you have a complete inventory of everything that's connected in your network in terms of your network infrastructure. You know what servers are performing what services and where they're located in the network. As far as your router switch infrastructure, you know the inventory as far as brands, operating systems, all that very specific information. Why is this important? Well, how will you know if you're looking at your network and performing a survey, especially if we're talking about inventory, how will you know if there have been the insertion of rogue devices if you didn't know what existed there to begin with? So something could look very normal if you weren't privy to the information that, wait a minute, I know we have all Cisco APs. What is this funky AP doing showing up in my inventory list? So you have to have the ability to recognize when something is or could be the representation of a rogue device installed by an attacker. Oh, or guess what? It could be an employee that just wanted to extend their network, plug in a Linksys switch. You didn't have the proper controls configured on your switches to shut the port down, and they were given access and able to install that switch, and now they've created a huge vulnerability in your network by adding that device that is not necessarily secure. So you want to take that a step further in establishing your traffic baseline and define what ports and protocols are used in your environment. What do you never want to see? So we could talk about this for a very long time, but just a brief, succinct list here is, well, you probably don't want to see any peer-to-peer software, because peer-to-peer software, unless specifically approved for your organization, is going to create a huge vulnerability. It has the ability to bypass firewalls and traffic inspection because it creates those end-to-end connections. There is the attackers sometimes use the TCP port 1080, which industry has designated this particular port for the socket secure SOCs. And this typically is indicative of some malicious software that's been installed on your network. Trojan horse, a worm, the old MyDoom and Bugbear have historically used ports 1080. So having the familiarization that this is not there in your normal traffic baseline when this was captured, and then seeing that, of course, could be a indicator of compromise. It's also important to point out that hackers are lazy by nature. And this may surprise some of you, but they don't take time to invent something genius or witty in terms of the service or the port that they configure their code to operate on. So many times they get very lackadaisical and use port numbers that are easy to remember. Something like 234 or 567 or 666. There are some backdoor and Trojan horse softwares that use port 444, and you want to make sure that you're examining these connections both inbound and outbound. So web traffic, again, doesn't have to use port 80. It could be set up to use port 8080, 8088, or 8888. So you're just really looking for things that are strange, and again, strange is not going to be that strange if you don't have the normal picture of your network. So we reiterate with this slide again, what is the current state of your network? You ascertain the current utilization of network resources. Now, I didn't hit on utilization too much. So different traffic patterns during different times of the day. So you want to know what is the utilization pattern. It should be very defined, and if it isn't, you want to have some picture to be able to compare that to. It is important that you capture traffic during different times of the day because different times represent different patterns. So you should have basically traffic patterns captured for days on end that include morning, that include lunchtime, that include after hours, that include afternoon, all these different times so that you're able to quickly determine if something appears abnormal. And just in case you're wondering, yes, I have moves like this guy on the slide. So what type of information is being collected? What types of information do I have to analyze? So we'll start with a full packet capture. Now this is the most extensive type of data of network security monitoring data. It will actually include any executables. If you wanted to extract content that was part of an email, you could go in and extract that content. But what type of information you collect is really going to be determined by how you place your sensors. So this will directly affect the conversations that you're seeing when you're analyzing these different types of data. So generally, sensing interfaces are placed at choke points. So if you had an ingress point behind an internet-based firewall perhaps, or maybe you want to place that sensor in your data center, or an ingress point for a remote access VPN. Oh, I apologize, I didn't mean to go there yet. So the full packet capture is going to have the full accounting of communication between our different endpoints. And it's normally stored as what's referred to as a PCAP, which we'll talk about in a minute when we get into the Wireshark and TCP dump. This has great granularity and the ability to offer great analytical context, as it has all of the encapsulated headers from layer 2, layer 3, layer 4, and so forth. So inside the full packet capture, it could include session data as well as statistical data. So you would have multiple data types by capturing the full packet. But what you have to worry about here and what you have to be concerned with is full packet captures can be very storage intensive. So sometimes you just turn this feature on in order to troubleshoot, or you're looking for a specific anomaly or something specific to an incident. So you would capture packets for a specific period of time and then turn this feature off unless you have some incredible storage for full packet captures, because this can get this can exceed your storage requirements very quickly. So the next type of data is what we call session data, and I like to compare this to a phone bill. So when you get your phone bill, and I don't know if anybody actually looks at their phone bill anymore, but what's included on that phone bill is a list of the calls that were made and perhaps the time, the length associated with those calls, and it's going to have like your usage information concerning what number was called and the length and time of that call. Well, the session data it includes that specific information that references the 5 IP tuple. And this is basically the source and destination IP address, the source and destination port, as well as the protocol. And this information can be gathered using different protocols or technologies like SFlow, which is a sampling technology, and NetFlow, which is Cisco's version that was actually adopted by the IETF as a standard. And so if you're using NetFlow from Cisco, you're going to always use version 9. If you're using the IETF, that aligns with the NetFlow version 9, but they actually call it IP fix. So you could see that SFlow, NetFlow, or the IP fix. So these are ways that we can collect these different conversations. And if we're looking specifically for who talked to who and when, then we would go retrieve that session data. You could have more sophisticated information included in the session, such as the actual total packet count and the total byte count. And this could be accounted for. So NetFlow actually establishes the information in a unidirection. So if you have you would have information from both directions in a unidirectional flow, if that makes any sense. While the session data seems very simple as far as if you were looking at your telephone bill and you're like, there's no conversation information here, it's really not useful. But session data is very important if I am trying to figure out, I know there's a list of external malicious IP addresses associated with malicious domains, and I want to know if any internal systems have actually communicated out to those external IP addresses. I could use my session data to retrieve that information and be able to make that determination. Other methods to collect data include the test access point, which is actually referred to as a network tap. This is a hardware tool, and it will allow you to access and monitor the network, and it is actually placed in line to your traffic. So it will split a duplex connection into 2 separate simplex connections, and this will allow a sensor to dedicate 2 different interfaces that receive traffic from that tap. While this guarantees your network bandwidth, it's not going to necessarily determine that you have the compute capacity to be able to view all the data that your tap has stored. Another way of collecting data is using what's called a span port, switch port for analysis. And you'll also hear this referred to as port mirroring. So this is configured as a single sensing interface, and your switch port is basically going to be set up. It won't be able to be used as an access port for anything else, because it is going to take the traffic, both transmit and receive, and mirror it to some device that is a computer that's running a protocol analyzer in order to be able to examine those network packets. So if you're looking for something specific that's coming in, depending on where you configure this span port, it can mirror the traffic from one port that we would refer to as the source port, and we could say mirror the traffic destined to another port. And so we would specify that port and then have it copy to wherever our protocol analyzer was stored. So I think it's important to point out here, even though this is a method that you can use, it is the least reliable method, because this is a function that is performed in software, and there could be a lot of packets that are missed as a result of the fact that we're copying both transmit and receive traffic. So it is the least reliable in terms of data collection. Now we're going to talk about indicators of attacks versus indicators of compromise. I don't know if I have anybody else on the call today who likes to be proactive. It seems to be that there are few of us around in today's society. I'm raising 2 children that are procrastinators and not proactive in anything, and I promise you they don't get that from their mother. But indicators of attack allow us to be proactive. So we're specifically looking for any actions that can be tied together instead of allowing those events to be random and isolated. We look at things through a very critical thinking perspective and then think it through, do they have any relation, any way to correlate these events? And you're actually focusing on the indicators of attack. You're focusing on what are the attacker's action on objectives. Now, that action on objectives is a term that actually comes from the cyber kill chain, and it has us focus very specifically on the intent as opposed to the tool or the actual craft that the attacker is using. So we analyze and concentrate on the fact that there are certain specific things that must happen in order for this attack to be successful. So say, for instance, the attacker must find a vulnerability, find a box to exploit, find a vulnerability in that box, successfully exploit, run some code, execute some code, possibly establish persistence using a command and control channel, and then move from one segment of the network to another in order to be able to perform their actions on objectives. And let's just say in this case, it were data exfiltration. So it depends on the particular type of attack. What are we trying to do with this attack? And what is, a lot of people think of this in the wrong way. We actually think the minute code is executed on that box, that is the actual action on objective. But if we stopped there, there really wouldn't be any breach at that point, right? There could be some malicious software installed, but no data leakage or data exfiltration or data deletion performed at that point. So you have to think it past the point of actually injecting the code, and then does this attack require some sort of established persistence? Because successful attack depends on all of those things happening. Whereas the indicator of compromise is a more reactive approach. We know, because we have some evidence, compromise, the indicator of compromise actually comes from a forensic science term, and it means that something's happened and we have that artifact, we have the evidence, and we're going to go back and investigate it, and we're going to look for clues as to how this happened. And our goal in doing that is to be able to offer information to our threat intelligence community and offer information inside our organization to ensure this doesn't happen again. The same way they got in before. It's like you've heard the old saying, you fooled me once, bad on me, you fool me twice. No, that's not it. You fool me once, shame on you. You fool me twice, shame on me. So I think that's it. If I didn't get it right, just put it in the chat and I'll practice and say it again tomorrow. So the indicator of compromise is going to give information that can change. So the fact that the malware had a specific signature and specific characteristics doesn't mean that it's going to keep those same characteristics, because the attackers are very sophisticated in their deployment of this malware to change it just enough and alter the code just enough that it is able to get around any device that's performing signature-based detection. The IP addresses tear down and set up somewhere else. They set up camps under new domains and new IP addresses as quick as you can take another breath. So you can't really tie that particular IOC to an IP address. All that information could be specific to this attack, but can change. The actual exploit that's used is going to be different for every organization, different for every network, because there'll be different exploits that work in one organization that may not work in another. But it sure is a beautiful thing if I can take the same exploit that I crafted for one organization and use it again in multiple places. Other information that you should be aware of is that attackers are going to try to leverage any normal service that we offer in our network. And a normal service would be DHCP. A normal service would be DNS. So if there is any way they can exploit the normal protocols that we must have running in order to perform network operations, then they will try to leverage those protocols in order to hide information or establish command and control. So some of these specific indicators of compromise, of course, malware can be part of an executable file. So you want to look for any specific executables. Of course, a .exe functions exactly like a program. So maybe you downloaded a calculator that is a functional program but has malicious software tied to it. So if you see an executable file in your network that's being transferred, it should be considered an indicator, and then you should take the necessary precautions to drill into it to see and evaluate its legitimacy. The next thing you see on the list here, SLED, and the letter we'll actually talk about on the next slide. You actually see the well-known signatures. So I like to think about this in terms of if a bad guy goes into a store to rob a store and the store has video cameras, they're going to take a picture, they're going to do video surveillance, and say he wasn't smart enough to wear a mask. So he goes in, he holds up the store. That video footage captures characteristics, which we could also refer to as artifacts, of the bad guy who came in to rob the store. So when the investigation starts and we're trying to catch said bad guy, we're going to use the information from that video footage in order to create a profile to release to the public. He had brown hair, he was 6'5", he had these very specific characteristics. So that is what we do when malware propagates through a network. We use the artifacts and the information of that malware to build a signature. And the signature is how we detect and look for that malware in other systems to hopefully mitigate its further propagation. You can also have mismatched protocols or unusual traffic. So when we talk about mismatched protocols, your ports can range from 0 to 65,535. And there are well-known ports that are ranged from 0 to 1023, and then 1024 to some specific number that I don't remember off the top of my head. You can actually reserve for specific applications, and then past a certain point, which I think is 49,000 to 65,535, these are actually our dynamic or private ports. So they're what we call ephemeral ports. I can't say that word very well. Ephemeral. There we go. You just have to say it fast. So the ephemeral ports are the dynamic ports that's assigned to an application if it's being sourced from a system destined to a specific well-known port like port 80. So when we're talking about a mismatch protocol, it requires you to know the well-known ports. Say for instance, SSH is 22, Telnet is 23, SMTP is 25, HTTP is port 80, POP3 is 110, and all the different well-known ports. So you would know that DNS is 53, DHCP is 57. So if you saw, say for instance, traffic that was crafted as a DNS request destined to port 80, that is an indicator of compromise. Okay, that's something that you definitely want to drill into and investigate. The traffic may appear as normal, but we all know everything that appears normal is not always normal. So you could be, stumbling upon something that is an actual indicator of compromise if you take the time to look through things that appear normal. So many times these mismatched protocol, if you're viewing those in Wireshark, it's important to bring up that these often show up in a black color because Wireshark knows that a particular protocol is supposed to use, a particular well-known application is supposed to use a specific transport protocol. And let me be more specific there. If the SMTP application, Simple Mail Transfer Protocol application is running, it is supposed to run on TCP. So if SMTP shows up on port or being carried by UDP, that is a network anomaly. That is something that is unusual. So we would actually see that show up in our Wireshark display, and we would want to investigate that. And sometimes this happens if attackers are trying to evade security and get through a firewall by looking like some specific allowed protocol. Okay, now we'll briefly discuss a NOP SLED. So if you've never heard of this particular type of an attack, it is a buffer overflow exploit. It actually exploits the specific area of memory called stack memory. And so if you think about the different areas of memory, you have your kernel space, you have your stack space, you have your heap memory, and then where your data, your actual variables are stored, as well as what we call the text area of memory. So this particular exploit is crafted to overflow the buffer to a point that we create a NOP SLED. Now the NOP SLED basically, and NOP stands for no operation. So I want to create enough no operation actions, if you'll allow me to say it that way, to overwrite the memory pointer that tells the system, once a system call is made, where to go back to that area of memory and resume the application or resume that function. We want to overwrite that pointer. So we're using the NOP SLED basically to overwrite the existing pointer, and then somewhere in the series of the no operations that we build, the attacker will hide his malicious code. And then the malicious code will be executed somewhere in the middle of that NOP SLED. Now, you see a picture on here and you're like, what in the world does this picture have to do with what you just said? So a NOP SLED is recognized by the hexadecimal representation of 0x90. So if you're looking through all these hexadecimal notations here, we can very quickly see where the NOP SLED starts. So in the NOP SLED, the reason they call it a SLED is basically it's a downward slide to execute these no operations, which tells the machine instruction, do nothing here, move on to the next operation. It sees that again and again and again, and to the point where it's this downward slide until we get to where the attacker has hidden his malicious code. Now, from an analyst point of view, if we're looking at this PCAP, we see this is very obvious, isn't it? This isn't obscure or, you know, very well hidden from an attacker's perspective. So if you go back to the previous slide, you see letters here. Instead of actually using the 0x90, which came very easy and familiar by analysts to recognize and quickly detect, they started using letters. So you can accomplish the same thing, but basically use more obscure tactics in building your NOP SLED instead of the 0x90. And 0x is always indicative of a hexadecimal representation. Okay, so now we get to actually talk about Wireshark. So Wireshark, by definition, is a protocol analyzer, and it allows us to capture packets in real time and then view those packets inside the Wireshark tool, which has a ton of useful information. The format of these files is actually stored as a PCAP, and you can render a PCAP using the TCP dump application or WinDump application. This tool will allow you to perform packet analysis on different layers of information, and I'll actually show you what I mean by the different layers of information, and helps us to be able to conduct event correlation as well as finding those indicators of compromise. Say, for instance, the executable that we talked about earlier. We can actually go in Wireshark and do a follow TCP stream and actually view an executable that was transferred between two hosts. So it does have a very easy to use interface for graphic viewing. It's not well suited, of course, for very large PCAPs. You can have remote capture that can be performed on Windows only. So you're going to start that remote packet capture on a local service and then connect to the remote interface on Wireshark to target IP bound to the socket 2002. So you can look at the statistics. We'll go over all the information that's available in the statistics, how you can use the tool functionality to write an ACL rule. So I talked to you earlier about the fact that a lot of the issues, many breaches or compromises, can actually be the result of misconfiguration. So you don't want that to be you as a security admin because you misconfigured a rule. So anything that you can help verify or validate or give you a basis for generation, you want to use those tools that are at your disposal. And from the file section of Wireshark, you can actually go in and export different objects. And a really cool feature of Wireshark is the ability to look into different source IP, destination IP addresses, and find their geolocation. So maxmind.com basically has a database that translates the IP address to the specific geolocation of where that IP address is on a map. So if you've got the North America, it would basically generate a map and then pinpoint those locations of where those specific endpoints were located. So you would go into edit and the preferences and make sure you go into name resolution, and from there you would upload your database from MaxMind, and you're actually going to do this in your lab that I believe is the packet, if I could talk it would help, packet introspective lab, and you'll actually do this functionality and you can answer some questions as a result. So the next utility that we'll go over is TCP dump. Now we said that that Wireshark was not good for parsing large PCAPs, but TCP dump can actually capture and parse large amounts of traffic. The header information can be displayed at various levels of detail, which we also is synonymous with the word verbosity. So the more verbose you want to display your packet capture, you would specify the TAC V option, and if you add an additional V, it increases the level of detail. TAC X actually provides payload information, which is similar to the hexadecimal interpretation window that we talked about in Wireshark. And you can also run TCP dump without displaying your captured information. So if you want to run TCP dump, but you don't want that information displayed on screen, you would use the -Q option for that. So conversely, if you want to watch the packet capture live, then you're going to use the TAC VV command. So for those of you in my CCNA CyberOps class, you know that I like to look at your faces on screen and get your nods and like for you to talk back to me during my class. So this is a lot more difficult doing it live in this way because I can't see your faces. And I don't know if you're tracking or not, but I hope everybody's good. If you're having issues, go ahead and put those in or log into the WebEx room, and Sarah is there waiting to help you out. Okay, so we talked about Wireshark, we talked about TCP dump, and I'm actually going to demo some TCP dump and look at some PCAPs here in a moment once we get through these encapsulation and headers. So I'm gonna start with a bit of a review here, and please forgive me if you're already privy to this information, but please understand that everybody may not be at the same level, everybody that we have on the call here. So I'm just gonna take some time to go over the information that you see here on screen to make sure we're on the same sheet of music. So the OSI model is the Open Systems Interconnection model. There's actually 7 layers that we use. It's a conceptual model that's used to understand and troubleshoot network issues. So each layer, the application layer, presentation layer, session layer, transport layer, network, data link, and physical. So each layer has what's called a specific protocol data unit. And while this is academic, it is it's very important from an analyst perspective and just from a general network understanding that you know these protocol data units, because they allow you to isolate the specific functionality to a specific layer and then take that a step further and think about, well, what should I see at that layer? What information is represented there? So that's what we have depicted in these 2 pictures for you to be able to differentiate that information. So you have your physical layer, which that's where our bits actually go out on the wire, our 1s and 0s, the machine language as the information has been encapsulated. So let me back up and say that encapsulation, when we use that term, is a downward process. So we're always going to start in the application. So if you think about the application, you think about an email message, you may think about a web browser. So whatever the application is, it starts as your data. And then it is sent downward to the presentation, and this could be sent at presentation for formatting, compression, encryption is performed here. And then we actually have our session layer. In the session, we're actually given a session ID where the conversation can be tracked. And then we go from the upper layers, and so most of those are actually just referred to as upper layers. Then we have our transport layer, which is where TCP or UDP can operate. And we're going to talk about the difference between those in just a moment. So these are our transport layer protocols, and we have a specific TCP or UDP header. So notice that we started with our application data that had the specific upper layer headers, and then we encapsulated that data with the TCP UDP header. As encapsulation is a downward process, we move to layer 3, which is the network layer. We still have our data, our upper layer headers, our TCP UDP header. Now we attach our IP header, and now we have what's called an IP datagram or an IP packet. From there, if we can make an assumption here, and I will just make the assumption for the sake of this example, that our layer 2 would be Ethernet. So we have our upper layer information, TCP IP is encapsulated here, and then we're going to add our layer 2 header as well as what's called the layer 2 trailer. So this would be specific to whatever layer 2 protocol we're operating here. And it's important that you understand that this is local, that this is a local encapsulation process, and layer 2 is typically removed and rewritten every time a packet moves throughout a routed network. So there's specific things that happen, and that layer 2 is considered the local part of this packet. So when we talk about Ethernet, that's why we say Ethernet is a protocol that runs on a local area network, because if we have to travel across a network to a different layer 3 IP network, we're going to need to use a router that operates at layer 3. And just to quickly move over here, as this data is transferred across the wire via whatever means, this could be fiber optic, this could be wireless through the air, this could be whatever, Ethernet over ATM, whatever the technology that's present here, then it's going to be transferred and received as bits, and then each layer of encapsulation that we added over here is going to be removed and processed accordingly as de-encapsulation on the receiving side, all the way up until we get the actual data at the upper layer. So in the layer 2 frame header, it's very specific. You see the Ethernet frame that is included as part of our IP header here. So there's a lot of redundant information that you see on this slide, but here we've actually shown that when we have our application data, whether this be an FTP session, an HTTP browsing session, it has added the TCP header, we've added the IP header, so we've encapsulated this data with this information and added the appropriate layer 2 frame information. So in this case, the example is an Ethernet frame. So what's inside the IP header is specific to IP. What's inside the Ethernet frame is specific to the layer 2 Ethernet. So this could very well be what's called a WAN protocol and be PPP, or as I said before, Ethernet over ATM or Ethernet over PPP. Could be something along those lines. So you would have to look at this specific to whatever technology would be present there. So inside the layer 3 header, and you may ask yourself the question, why is this important for me to know? This seems like way too much information. Okay, remember, as a security analyst, your focus is to determine normal and then basically be able to look at IP headers, look at TCP headers, and the information and alerts that's being generated as part of indicators of attack or indicators of compromise, and determine what has happened. So if you don't know what's supposed to be in a layer 3 header, an IP header, or you don't know what's supposed to be in a TCP header, then how are you going to know if it's being exploited? How are you going to know if it's been tampered with? How do you know this layer 3 header for ICMP that includes an ICMP is not tunneling data through its data channel, which we actually talk about as part of a network attack on tomorrow. So the more familiar you are with what is inside these headers, so notice we have here the actual version. So this, of course, is 4 bits, and if it's version 4, it's going to be 0100, or 0010 would be the best way to describe that. And then if it were IPv6, it would be 0011 to just denote the specific IP version. The internet header length is 4 bits. The type of service is the field where we are allowed to set priority for this specific packet. So say, for instance, this were a video packet that we wanted to prioritize, or a voice over IP packet. We're going to use what's called the toss byte, which includes a set of bits for differentiated services code point, which is implemented as part of a quality of service operation in order to prioritize IP packets. The total length field, the identification or fragment ID section, the fragment offset for don't fragment or must fragment flags that are included here, the time to live value, the protocol field, the header checksum. So time to live value is what a device uses to determine the time for this packet to live. So every time a packet traverses a layer 3 device, the layer 3 device is required to open it and decrement the TTL. Once the TTL reaches 0, then the packet has to die. So why this is important is there's different information that can come from this TTL, and there's a lot of OS fingerprinting that can be done by looking into this time to live value, as well as the protocol field. The protocol field is actually telling us the upper layer protocol to expect as part of this layer 3 header. This could be the TCP protocol or a UDP protocol. So that's what's up from the IP layer. Say, for instance, if it were TCP, that would be denoted by the number 6, while if it were UDP, it would be denoted by the number 17. The header checksum is basically a hash value that's associated with this packet, which is ran again once this IP packet is received at its destination. And if for some reason that hash value is not the same, those of you who remember as part of any cryptography class, then that means the data has been altered. We have violated integrity. So that means there's an error or something there, and we don't want to trust the information that's on the inside. The source address and destination address is 32 bits, only if this is an IPv4 header. If it's a IPv6, of course, it's going to be 128 bits in both the source and destination. And typically, IP headers should not change. They're actually used to route information end to end, but we do have some technologies like NAT, network address translation, that can alter an IP header. And there's also options that you see here, and the information that's in the options could be used to store or hide information. So you have to be aware of that as well. So looking at this same, we looked at the OSI and the different layers that were presented there. And I just wanted you to look at the Wireshark information with this same information displayed. So remember, we had the IP protocol and the specific version. So we see that in our Wireshark analysis, as well as the source IP address, the destination IP address. We see the header length is displayed as 20 bytes. So I'm going to flip back really quick. all of these, the internet header link, the version, the type of service, all of these fields are now correlating to what we're seeing in our Wireshark view. So this differentiated services field is that toss byte that I talked to you about, where we can change the toss byte to prioritize this packet. When it's read and processed by different devices, it will be processed and placed in the queue based on its marking here. Your flags, if we move back to this area here for the fragment offset and those different flags, you see those are listed, the don't fragment and more fragments. So if that bit is set, you can see that would be listed here. And if they're not set, of course, they show up here as 0. The time to live value, protocol here, TCP number 6, the header checksum, and here we don't have the actual name resolution configured as part of the preferences to translate the endpoints using the GeoIP. Now let's move to layer 4, the layer 4 TCP header. So we have 2 protocols that operate at layer 4, TCP and UDP. And you're going to see that the TCP header is much larger than your UDP header. So it requires more processing, involves more latency than that of UDP, because TCP is a protocol that we say is connection oriented. And in order for us to properly state that it's connection oriented, we have to say that it has some connection oriented properties. Like when I send the data, it's going to be sent with sequence numbers. And before I ever send any data, let me just back up and say that we're required to establish a 3-way handshake. And that is using the synchronization bit or the synchronization flag. That's the first communication that's sent by the source. As it's received by the receiver, they will send back an acknowledgement, and then the sender acknowledges the acknowledgement. So that's the 3-way handshake that's part of the TCP RFC. So once that handshake says, okay, we're good, we've set a window size to know how much data we'll send between the two of us, we're going to have all these properties included in that process that say, if for any reason you didn't receive it, you're going to let me know that via this acknowledgement number, because it uses what's referred to as an expectational acknowledgement. Say, for instance, if I sent 50 bytes, the expectation acknowledgement that's sent by the receiver would be 51. That means I received 1 through 50, and the expectation acknowledgement should be 51. So a lot of exploits that are associated with TCP could be send flag flooding. So you're doing synchronization flooding, where you open these send connections, and the send connections were actually sent from a spoofed address, so they can't move through to the established state of TCP, because I can't, as a server or client, whatever the machine is that's being attacked, I can't find who I'm supposed to acknowledge to. So those sit in a particular data structure inside those devices, and there's only a specific area of memory reserved for them. So when there's a send flooding attack that occurs, that area of memory is exhausted, and it ends up launching a denial of service attack, an attack on availability of that particular service being rendered. So notice inside these different fields, I know this slide looks a little crazy, but in its craziness, I actually liked just how the data is correlated in its Wireshark equivalent. So you see the window size is listed here, the different flags that are a part of TCP. So the most ones that you'll see used, of course, is the send flag, the ACK flag, the fin flag, So because I formally say hello and go through a three-way handshake, which is considered a formal introduction, with TCP, when we are done with the session, we're going to formally tear that down. So that's going to be done when the fin bit is set. It means we're finished with the session can be terminated, and we say goodbye properly. But an attacker can actually send packets to a destination to tear down an established connection using this reset bit as well. So again, knowing all of these flags and what they do and their purpose, knowing all these fields and their responsibility as part of the connection-oriented purpose in TCP becomes very important. This is where we assign the port address, and the port address is specific to the type of service that is being rendered in the application. So if it's HTTP, for instance, if I am sourcing this from a dynamic port and I'm going to a web server, then the destination port would be the well-known port of port 80 for HTTP, the HTTP protocol. So this is where the source and destination port numbers are assigned. This is where, if this is TCP, I should look to see recognized protocols that are carried by the TCP protocol. So say, for instance, I would never have TFTP port 69 in a TCP header, because that is actually carried by the UDP protocol. So again, these are, if you're drilling into the Wireshark view of this TCP session, and I just showed you that this specific flag is a send flag that's being sent from this source to this destination, and you see that this is turned on. So the send flag is set as this is a synchronization packet. Over here in the right-hand corner, it's just a description of all those flags so that you can become familiar with those. Again, the more familiar you are, you know what's normal, you know what to expect in seeing those different flags set, and can better recognize a network anomaly or a series of actions that are associated with a network attack. So going back to TCP, we said TCP is reliable, that it does a formal introduction. So I'll tell you a quick joke here so that you'll have context for the next slide. So a TCP packet walks into a bar and sits down and says hello to the bartender. The bartender says hello, and the gentleman or lady says, "I'd like to order a beer." And the bartender responds back, "You would like to order a beer?" And the patron replies back, "Yes, I would like to order a beer." So that is TCP packet walking into a bar ordering a beer. That's the example of that. And I would tell you what UDP would say, but I'm afraid you might not get it. Now, the context of that joke is there's no reliable properties in UDP. You might not get it. And that's the reliable, synchronized, ordered delivery of TCP is not a part of UDP. So a UDP packet bar walks A into is what you would get if a UDP packet goes to the bar, because those packets don't arrive in order, and there's no reliable properties associated with them. So for applications like streaming video, music, trivial file transfer protocol, voice over IP packets, there's a lot less latency, as you can see with the size of the UDP header, than what we saw with TCP. So does UDP have exploits? Yes, there are UDP flooding, different things that that an attacker can actually attack on UDP packets, which can include the UDP checksum, which most oftentimes is an optional configuration as part of a UDP datagram. And this kind of summarizes TCP and UDP in a nutshell. So TCP, you get to slowly or as fast as the person can intake that water, they drink, swallow, and are able to process that water into their system in an efficient way. But UDP over here, he's getting waterboarded. He's like, yeah, you're just sending it to me faster than I can drink it, faster than I can process. And so they say a picture's worth 1,000 words, and I think this pretty much summarizes the TCP UDP story. Okay, so with that being said, I'm just going to take a brief moment to see where we are and see if we have time to do a demo. So give me just 1 second to do that. Okay, so in the interest of time, we are actually going to let you take off and do your labs, since you actually have 3 labs to do this afternoon. But with your labs, I want to relay a note from Sarah concerning what's going on with those labs. So they aren't actually parsing your grade information to Canvas. You can continue to work on the labs. Your grade information is being stored. The problem is actually parsing your grade from your VM to Canvas. So we'll get that worked on. There's being a patch that is pushed tonight, and Sarah's going to walk you through all that information tomorrow as far as how that patch works. But please understand that you can continue to work through your labs. There's no issue with you doing that. And we'll be able to pull your grade information, and you'll be able to see that reflect in your Canvas course once this patch is stored. Okay, so you have 3 labs that's part of this session, and please bear in mind that if you are working through these slowly, the actual Snort Lab is considered an advanced lab. So if you do not get to it, there are no worries. The Telnet has you go through Wireshark and look at some of the things we talked about. And remember what I always say, what labs are for. The things we talked about in lecture that you were kind of like, I don't really know that. Like the endpoints, say for instance, with how they translate the geolocation. You're going to have a lab that demonstrates that. So that is where you're going to solidify that concept with what we talked about, and then you get the hands-on to actually do that within your lab environment. So do the Telnet lab first. It's going to review some of the Wireshark analysis and have you look at the different layers that we discussed. Your packet introspection lab has you look at various PCAPs and specific information in those PCAPs. So every one that you look at, you're looking for a different thing. And then the Snort Lab is going to have you look at rules and how those rules are configured, and you'll move through that with no problem. Again, prioritize them in the order that you see on screen. If you have any issues, feel free to reach out to me via email. If we are not on live chat at that particular time, I'll be happy to help you any way I can. And we can also follow up with questions tomorrow morning in our next live session. Thank you for your time this afternoon. It was great seeing you guys, and I hope you have fun working through these labs.